The 1923 Great Kanto earthquake left Tokyo in destruction, but the Imperial Hotel stood tall. Frank Lloyd Wright, Breaking Barriers in Earthquake Resistance, the story of a man influenced by nature. Frank Lloyd Wright influenced America by creating new technology in his Imperial Hotel that could withstand earthquakes. The Imperial Hotel, located in Tokyo, Japan, connected Eastern and Western architecture by using new materials, such as lava rock, using reinforced steel to help hold up the roof and the walls, and by incorporating both European and Asian styles. Wright also invented the prairie style of architecture, giving America a new, unique look and feel, separate from Europe. June 8, 1867, in Richland Center, Wisconsin, Frank Lloyd Wright was born to William Russell Carey Wright and Anna Lloyd Jones. Even before he was born, his mother wanted him to be an architect. She put engravings of the great cathedral in his bedroom. His mother, Anna Lloyd Jones, bought Wright his first set of building blocks and told him to build. When he was 11, he was sent to his family's farm in Wisconsin every summer in the Midwest where there was a lot of flat land. This encouraged him to design a style of architecture he would later call the Prairie House. Growing up, Wright's family was so poor they could not afford to send him to a school for architecture. Instead, Wright attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studied civil engineering. At school, Wright noticed that he was different from most of his peers. He would wear a top hat and used a cane when he walked around campus. But he left college 3 months before he graduated because he wanted to be out in the world on his own, away from his family's problems, and start his career as an architect. So he moved to Chicago in 1887 because many architects were rebuilding the ruined city after the Great Chicago Fire. In Chicago, Wright's uncle helped him get a respectable job for Joseph Lyman Silsbee, a Midwestern architect. But Wright didn't want to settle for this job. So he went to the best architect in Chicago, Louis Sullivan, and asked for a job. While working for Sullivan, he helped prepare drawings for the Auditorium Theater. Not long after, Sullivan promoted him to chief draftsman because, as he said, Wright was a good pencil in the master's hand. The 1893 World Fair greatly influenced most of the architecture for the 1890s and the beginning of the 19th century. The fair was themed with a Greek revival mode. Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan, however, did not like the fair. They believed that in American architecture, form must follow function, and they wanted to look to the future rather than the past. When Wright was 26 years old, Sullivan discovered that Wright had been making bootlegged houses and promptly fired him. So Wright established his own company. It was in this time that Wright designed his prairie style, where porches flowed and the house connected with its milieu. The prairie houses were low and horizontal, and often looked like they grew out of the ground, partly because Wright used wood and other natural materials.
Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to create a genuine, original American architecture. So even from the 1890s to the 1900s, he rejected Victorian architecture, Greek architecture, Roman revival, Romanesque revival.
While other architects of this time focused to Europe for inspiration, Frank Lloyd Wright was inspired by Japanese architecture. Wright visited Japan in 1905 and was fascinated by their unique style. He said, "I saw the native home in Japan, and as a supreme study in elimination, not only of dirt, but the elimination of the insignificant. I found this ancient Japanese dwelling to be a perfect example of the modern standardizing I had myself been working out. Although there was one complication. Japan sits on the Ring of Fire, which accounts for 90% of the world's earthquakes. The Ring of Fire is made of two tectonic plates in the Pacific Ocean that often shift and cause seismic activity. Japan alone is responsible for 20% of the 6.0 and higher magnitude earthquakes. Smaller earthquakes happen almost daily. Every year, Japan gets on average 1,500 earthquakes, and the major cities like Tokyo would be reduced to rubble. After World War I, Japan experienced an economic boom. In the early 1900s, most houses were made of wood, and they were not very sturdy or fireproof. The land in Japan was not very level or stable, especially in the poor neighborhoods. Usually 3 generations were living in one house. Japan did have a designated fire department, but it was not very big and they did not have all the tools we have today. Trains were introduced to Japan in 1872 by the Vulcan Foundry. Many Japanese took these trains to get to work, school, and other appointments. Japan had been working on establishing their public school system, and by the late 1920s, the government required all school-aged children to attend school. Most adults worked as laborers or stayed home to take care of their parents and make the meals. Before starting his work, Wright took his own advice and learned everything he could about the client and the land. Knowing that Japan had so many earthquakes, he soon found out that many Japanese were being killed by falling roof tiles. The roofs of most Japanese buildings were very big and heavy, so Wright replaced the bulky roof tiles with a light copper roof that was held up by beams. He also put an extra steel frame on the roof and the walls to make them sturdy, and made most of the hotel out of lava rock to make it strong and fireproof. Wright also put rubber dampers and shock absorbers to avoid the walls from cracking, and he placed the building on loose soil so the building's foundation would not shake with the ground. When the first blow of the 1923 7.9 magnitude Great Kanto earthquake hit Japan at 11:58 a.m. on September 1st, chaos began to spread. This massive earthquake surprised the many people in Japan that were cooking lunch at the time it struck. Almost all of the buildings crashed to the ground within seconds and caught fire. More than 140,000 people were killed by the earthquake. The Imperial Hotel, however, did not fall or burn. The Imperial Hotel was one of the few buildings left standing after the Great Kanto earthquake. It rose from the disaster with only minor shock damage. After the earthquake, many were left homeless and in need of food and shelter. The Imperial Hotel was put into service to provide sanctuary. Fires had started around the city due to the fact that the earthquake struck around lunchtime while everybody was cooking over large fires. The bellboys used the water from the Imperial Hotel's vast reflecting pool to put out fires and deliver water to those in need, since there was no other easily accessible pool of water. Later, a telegram was sent to Frank Lloyd Wright to notify him of his success, saying, "As monument of your genius, hundreds of homeless provided by perfectly maintained service." The Great Kanto earthquake cost Japan around $800 billion, equivalent to $24 trillion today. Most of the money was put to rebuilding the buildings that fell during the earthquake and repaving the roads that cracked. 700,000 houses were destroyed in the earthquake. We still use the technology in the Imperial Hotel today, and we are improving on it as time passes. Instead of building everything on loose soil, we are creating flexible pads to go under buildings and isolate the foundation from the ground so the building doesn't shake so violently. Most of the tall buildings in cities are made of wood, steel, or memory alloy because the materials have a good weight-to-strength ratio. In other words, the material is very strong but does not weigh a lot. Some tall buildings have metal or plastic rings on the ground underneath the building to minimize shaking. Like the Imperial Hotel, most buildings have a reinforced steel frame and shock absorbers on the roof and the walls. Frank Lloyd Wright paved the way for organic architecture and culturally influenced America by creating the Prairie style. He has 8 buildings in the UNESCO World Heritage List. The UNESCO World Heritage List is a list of buildings that are culturally or physically significant to the world. This list houses places like the Taj Mahal, the Great Wall of China, the Galapagos Islands, the Statue of Liberty, and the Great Barrier Reef. Frank Lloyd Wright moved architecture forward by looking to nature and working with it instead of against it. Frank Lloyd Wright broke architectural barriers by giving America its own architectural identity and creating earthquake-resistant buildings.
Wright was always something of a cultural nationalist, determined to find the roots of an American culture.
He invented the Prairie style of architecture and designed the Imperial Hotel. These things made Frank Lloyd Wright a legacy around the world. Most buildings incorporate his earthquake-resistant techniques in their work. We could not have all of our big cities if it wasn't for Frank Lloyd Wright introducing earthquake-resistant buildings. The buildings that Wright designed 50 years ago are still considered modern because American culture grew off the Prairie style. Frank Lloyd Wright is an icon to many because he broke so many barriers.